Now let's create our first application. Our first JPA application is going to be a desktop application. After this, we are going to directly move on to Java EE Server. So this is perhaps the first and last example of a desktop application using JPA in this chapter. So go to the Services tab and let's create the database connection to our ZooDB database. Right click on Database, New Connection, select MySQL, name of the database is ZooDB, password is MySQL. This you know when we installed MySQL server. Remember the password, test the connection, connection succeeded, next, finish. So let's see our connection. This is our connection. So here are our tables. Let's see one of the tables. So as you can see, you can view the data from inside NetBeans also. Let's create our application. Go to the Projects tab, right click, New Project, select Java, select a simple Java application. Let the application name be my JPA app. Finish. Now, for creating a JPA application, we have to basically perform three steps. First is we have to create entities. Entities creation is also known as object relational mapping. Entities basically are the counterparts to the tables in our database. Then using the JPA API, we perform the CRUD operations on the entities. CRUD stands for create, read, update, delete. So these are basically the 4 SQL operations. Then the third thing is we have to configure the application, which basically consists of creating this file named persistence.xml. You have to put the driver on the class path and so on. So let's go for the first stage, which is creation of the entities. Here is our database design from the first chapter. We'll create an entity for this class right now, or this table right now, staff. Go to the IDE, right click on source packages, new Java class. Let's name the class as staff. Let's put all our entities in a separate package, JPA app dot entities. So here's our class. Now the first thing is you have to put the JPA provider on your class path. Right click, add library. So we'll use Eclipse Link as our provider. You can also use Hibernate. Here is the provider added to your class path. Now the fields are staff ID, name, age, salary, gender. So let's create this field. Private int staff ID. Private string gender. So let's create getters and setters for all these fields. I right clicked and selected insert code, then I select getter and setter, then I select all these fields. So here's our entity, rather the class. Now you have to convert this class into an entity. So for this you have to use the entity annotation. So we'll select javax.persistence.entity, and another annotation you have to put for mentioning the primary key, which is ID annotation, which is also there in this package, javax.persistence. Select this. Now if you go to the workbench and if you select the table, you know we had selected auto increment for our primary keys. Now this feature you have to mention in your entity too. So go to your application and you have to use another annotation, which is generated value, and in this you have to mention strategy. The strategy is identity. Basically there are 4 strategies. We are going to study all the strategies in details later on. Right now our strategy is identity, because our table is going to auto generate the primary keys. Okay, Now here is our entity. The first step is finished. Second step is you have to use the JPA API to perform CRUD operations, that is create, read, update, delete operations on the entity we just created. For performing these operations, we have to first create an entity manager. So let's go to our application. Let's modify the main method. So first of all, we have to create an entity manager. Now the entity manager is obtained using an entity manager factory. So first we have to create the entity manager factory. So entity manager factory, let's name it EMF is equal to the entity manager factory is obtained from a class named persistence dot create entity manager factory. Now this string over here, some PU, we are going to put another string over here which somehow configures our application. Right now don't worry about it. Let's create our entity manager from this entity manager factory. So emf dot create entity manager, and let's name the entity manager em, and okay, so this is our entity manager. Now using this entity manager we are going to perform operations on this entity. Let's save it. Now we'll perform these operations on the database: create, read, update and delete. Now except read, all the other operations have to perform in a database transaction. So let's do that. So first of all, let's create a transaction. Entity manager dot get transaction dot begin, and then we'll write some code to create an entity later on. So let's commit the transaction, get transaction dot commit. Okay, now let's see how to create a new record in the database. Go here. First let's create a new instance, staff. Okay, let's assign some values to this class, or rather the object. Dot set name Raj, staff dot set age 25, dot set gender. Let's set the gender as M for male, F for female. Let's set the salary to 25k, and we won't set the primary key because primary key is as such auto incremented. Then we have to call a special operation on the database. Just because we have created the instance of an entity doesn't mean that the entity magically goes into the database. We have to perform the operation using the entity manager. So we'll perform the persist operation using the entity manager. Persist stuff. So this statement basically persists this object into the database. So basically we have performed the second stage, which is using the API for creating the record in the database. We'll see this operations later on. Now the third stage is you have to configure the application. The main thing in this is putting the persistence.xml file in the meta.im folder. Let's go to our source folder, or let's go to the application, create new, and let's select persistence unit, which basically creates the persistence.xml file. So here you have to select the database, which is going to be ZooDB, and we'll select none over here because we are not interested in creation of any tables. The tables are already created for us. We don't want to drop or create, or neither do we want to create any kind of tables. Here is basically the persistence.xml file generated by our IDE. Let's go to the source. So here is that file. So here you can see the parameters for connecting to the database. Let's copy this string over here, the name of the persistence unit, and we'll put it over here. That's how this entity manager gets to know which persistence unit it is going to use for connecting to the database. So now we have created entities, we have performed some operations on it, we have configured the application, we have put the persistence or XML file, but one more important thing remaining is you have to put the database driver on the class path. So let's put the driver on a class path, go to libraries, add library, let's add the SQL driver on a class path, MySQL, select MySQL JDBC driver. One more important thing is you have to close the entity manager as well as the entity manager factory. So let's do that. Entity manager.close. emf.close. Okay. So before running this application, we have to tell this persistence unit that the staff is an entity. So let's do that. You have to use the class element. Let's close off this class element and put the name of the entity over here. Save the persistence of the XML file. So that's it for the three stages. We created an entity, we performed CRUD operations, and we created the persistence of XML file, put the drivers on a class path. Here is the entity, here is the using program, here is the persistence of XML file, here is the driver, plus the JPA provider. So let's run this application. Right click on the main class and select run file. Let's go to the workbench, and I already selected this. Now let's refresh. As you can see, here is our record which has been entered using JPA. Now that we have performed the creation of the record in the database, let's now retrieve that record using the primary key. So let me comment this out for now, and let's find that entity back. Entity manager dot find. You have to tell the entity manager which entity we want to find, and you have to give the primary key. As you know, from the table the primary key is 1 over here. So let's create this is equal to now let's output this entity. Staff name is, let's see if the entity is retrieved properly or not. Staff.get name. Let's run this program, save the program and run it. Here it is, staff name is Raj, so the entity is retrieved properly. So as I mentioned before, except the read operation, all the operations have to be performed in a transaction. So let's now do the third operation, which is update, and later on we'll delete it. So let's comment this out, and let's now create another transaction for updating the database. Entity manager dot get transaction dot begin, and the transaction, dot commit, and let's first find this entity and then we'll update it. Same like before, you have to find this entity using find method. The primary key is 1. Now let's update it. Dot set. See, there is no particular command for updating. You have to just open the transaction and make changes to the entity and run the application. Let's go to the workbench and refresh. Here the name is changed. So let's perform the fourth operation on the database, which is delete. So we will delete this record. Go to the application, comment this out. Again, as I said, except for read, everything has to happen in a transaction. So entity manager dot get transaction dot begin, entity manager dot get transaction dot commit. Then again you have to find the class, or rather the entity, and then you have to use the remove command or the remove method stuff. Okay, this will remove this record from the database. Let's see if it does. Run this class and let's refresh the database. The record is gone.